Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I got my hands on the Retroid Pocket 6. We're going to do an impressions video here today. As the name implies, this handheld is the successor to the Retroid Pocket 5, which came out all the way back in 2025. And like with many other major Retroid releases, this one redefines what it means to be a mid-range handheld. The RP6 has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor. That's the same chip that we've seen in a bunch of other high-end handhelds over the past couple of years, but this time it's coming at a more affordable price point. This one starts at $230 before shipping. I've only had the handheld for about 24 hours, so this is going to be an impressions video. I'm going to poke and prod it as much as possible, and mostly focus on things like the look and feel of it, those things that I can figure out in that first day. Then wait about a week and I will do more thorough testing and release a final review. But I can also say right off the bat that there's a lot going for the Retroid Pocket 6. It seems to be an improvement over the Retroid Pocket 5 in many significant ways with no major drawbacks. The real question is going to be whether or not this is worth it for you to upgrade if you've already got something similar already, or whether or not this mid-range price point is the best match for you. Grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Alright, let's start with the specs. So I already mentioned that this has the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 CPU, which is integrated with the tried and true Adreno 740 GPU. This is a very compatible and powerful chipset. We've seen it in about a half dozen other handhelds over the years, and it does an excellent job of emulating just about everything you can find on the Android platform. Beyond emulation, it also does a great job with high-end Android games, and you can also play some PC gaming using apps like GameHub and GameNative. The Retroid Pocket 6 is going to come in two different SKUs. There is one with 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage, and then another one with an upgraded 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. We'll talk about these two differences later on. One update to the Retroid Pocket 5 is that it has a completely new OLED screen. It's the same size and resolution, 5.5 inches in 1080p, but it now has a higher refresh rate, 120 Hz. And like we've seen with previous devices running at this refresh rate, it's going to come in handy with retro gaming and will improve input latency on retro games too. The RP6 also has a larger battery. It's now 6,000 mAh, 20% larger than the Retroid Pocket 5. It also supports a 27-watt fast charge, and I was able to test that, and I was getting somewhere between 25 and 26 watts when I was charging it earlier today. It's also worth noting they've made some updates to their software that allow you to fine-tune your charging experience. You can change the overall volts and amps of your charging input, and you can even set it to an 80% charge limit, which will extend your battery life. And like we've seen with previous devices, they have a charging separation option, which will allow you to plug it in and play without having to charge the battery at the same time. In terms of weight, it's 305 grams, or a little bit under 11 ounces. This is about 30 grams heavier than the Retroid Pocket 5, likely because it has a larger battery. We've also got some nice connectivity improvements thanks to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, so this now supports Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3, and the USB port can also be used for DisplayPort out at 4K and 60 Hz. I didn't get a chance to test video out in this video, but I will put it in my final review. Same thing with battery life testing. That is something that takes a little bit longer to fully test. Like with other Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 systems, this one is running Android 13, and it's got a couple other features, like a 3.5mm headphone jack, a microSD card slot, as well as a rumble motor. Now, there are two different price points for this device depending on the amount of RAM and storage that you want. The base model has 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. This is the one that we'll be looking at here today, and the retail price is $230 before shipping. If you want to upgrade to 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, that's going to set you back $280 before shipping, so there is a $50 price difference between the two. It's also worth noting that as of making this video, the device has been available for pre-order for a couple months now, and it's just now starting to ship next week. If you were to pre-order one right now, they're saying that it's going to be shipping out in early March. So bear in mind that due to demand and previous orders, there is going to be a bit of a wait if you were to pick one up right now. And that is likely going to stabilize in the future unless these RAM and storage prices get even worse in the coming months. They're offering 5 different color options, and you can see them here: black, silver, and 16-bit, as well as orange, which I've always thought looks a bit more yellow, and then also a light purple option. Today I'll be testing out the silver one, but I also pre-ordered the orange one for myself myself, and I'm likely going to wait until that orange one is fully delivered before I make my final review. That way I can compare the two different color options. Now you might be wondering whether or not 8 or 12 gigs is the best fit for you, and I personally think that if you're going to be focusing on emulation specifically, even the high-end stuff, PS2 and Switch and Wii U, then 8 gigabytes of RAM is generally going to be okay. There might be a couple games here or there that might struggle with that amount of RAM, but for the most part, the vast majority will be absolutely fine with 8 gigs. For me, I think that the 12 gig model is really only going to help if you're looking for additional internal storage up to 256 gigs, but then also if you're going to be playing PC games via apps like Game Native and Game Hub, because those are more RAM intensive. But I think that most people are going to be fine with 8 gigabytes of RAM if you're going to be focusing on emulation, and you can save yourself $50. Now, one unique thing about the Retroid Pocket 6 is they are now offering 2 different control options. So you can have the D-pad up top or the stick up top, and you can choose that in either an 8 gig or 12 gig configuration. This is the first time that we've seen a major handheld have a feature like this, and I think it's awesome. It's probably a nightmare in terms of logistics for Retroid, but I am so glad that they did it. Now, the placement of the D-pad and analog stick are super subjective, and I think it's a very personal choice, but for me, I'm going to be going with the stick up top option for my own model, and that's because with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, I'm going to be able to play some of those additional systems that you can't play fully on the Retroid Pocket 5, and most of those systems were analog stick centric. So the way I see it, it makes more sense to put the analog stick up top because certain systems, going back all the way to the Nintendo 64, but then including GameCube, PS2, Switch, and Wii U, all those just do better with the analog stick up top because it feels more natural. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on when I play the Retroid Pocket 6, and that's why I chose the model on the bottom that has the analog stick up top. If you're going to be focusing on retro games, those that use the D-pad primarily, or you're going to be focusing on D-pad-centric types of games, for example, precision platformers, or maybe potentially more PSP gameplay, then I think the D-pad up top makes a lot of sense too. At the end of the day, I just think it's great that we even have this option in the first place with a high-profile handheld like the Retroid Pocket 6. So let's take a look inside of the box, and of note, this one was sent over by Retroid for review, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Inside the box, it's super simple, much like with their other devices, so you've got a diagram as well as some specs for the device, and then basically the device itself as well as a USB-C charging cable. So let's talk about my first impressions with the Retroid Pocket 6, and number one, with this particular model, is this kind of sparkly silver color, and it reminds me of a 90s style handheld, and I think it looks pretty cool. The texture itself is quite slick, as you can see here, again reminiscent of something a little bit older, and I do have to admit that I kind of miss the bumpy texture that we had on the back with the Retroid Pocket 5. Here's a quick comparison between the two, and you can see that yes, there's a bumpy texture on the back of the RP5, and nothing like that on the RP6. Same thing with the triggers. The RP5 had a little bit of a grippy texture that I really loved, and these on the RP6 are a bit more sleek. I ended up asking the company about this just because it felt like a step backwards. Aesthetically, I think it looks better, but I also think that it feels a little bit slick. They said that the way that they paint this shell didn't allow them to use a bumpy texture because the paint covered up the bumps, and then it just made it a little bit soft and weird, and so they took away the bumpy texture altogether in favor of this paint job. So first impression is that yeah, it looks cool and it kind of has a more 90s vibe and focused more on a nostalgic design. And that's what Retroid has always been known for. The RP5 kind of feels like an outlier because it was more modern and sleek. So I think it looks better, but I'm also missing the bumpy texture here on the back. The front also has a pretty nostalgic design. If we look at this screen and the way that it kind of bumps out right here and then circles around the edges, that's actually the same design as it was on the PSP. And so it almost feels like a very subtle nod to the whole PSP aesthetics where it's rounded on the sides and then squares up in the center, much in the same way that it does more dramatically on the original PSP. So I like that touch right here. I think it's really neat. Now the RP6 had a different design initially. Up top you can see this was the original design. It had 4 function buttons on the front and the speakers were placed below the screen. This made the device taller, a little bit more rounded, but it still had that PSP cutaway as well. When it was first announced, a lot of people pushed back on the design. They said they didn't like it, that it was maybe a little bit too chunky. I personally loved it, but they ended up having a poll to let customers vote whether or not they preferred one design over the other. Over 2/3 of the nearly 10,000 people that voted for this design chose the bottom one. I think that's kind of unfortunate because I really like the chunky nostalgia found in the top design. Those 4 function buttons in particular reminded me more of the PSP XP. The bottom design just looks more like a Retroid Pocket 5 and a couple little upgrades to it, and I think that's what we have to work with here today. To be fair, it is an excellent design. It's kind of got a tried and true look to it. It's comfortable to hold, it's got these nice ergonomic bumps on the back, but part of me also just misses these 4 buttons and the 2 speakers down below. I think it would have just been a more overall nostalgic experience and felt more Retroid, if that makes any sense. In terms of size, this is about exactly what you would expect. It's about the same size as the Retroid Pocket 5, maybe a little bit taller and slightly wider, but overall it's almost a dead ringer. The big difference here is that we've got a choice between the placement of the analog stick and the D-pad. It's definitely a sleek and compact handheld. If we compare it to the Nintendo Switch Lite, which has the same 5.5-inch size display, you can see that the RP6 is quite a bit smaller and more compact, especially because it doesn't have these big Switch Lite bezels around the sides of the screen. Another 5.5-inch device that is quite a bit bigger is the Anbernic RG557. This one has an OLED panel, but it also has some pretty chunky bezels, and then these built-in ergonomic grips just increase the size overall. So in terms of pocketability and portability, I think that the Retroid Pocket 6 has the upper hand. The handheld it reminds me of the most is the Odin 2 Mini. This one has a 5-inch screen and some pretty thick bezels as well, but the overall size is pretty similar between these two. And now that we have the analog stick up top, at least as an option with the Retroid Pocket 6, it kind of feels like its other brother. And depending on the color that you choose for the RP6, some of these will have crystal transparent buttons, much like they were on the PS Vita, as well as the Odin 2 Mini, so I like this overall look. Moving up to larger devices, here's the Odin 3. This one has a 6-inch display, same 1080p and 120Hz, but overall this handheld is quite a bit bigger and roomier. In my configuration, these also have a similar analog stick placement, so they look very similar. It kind of lends to the fact that the RP6 feels a bit generic in its design compared to a lot of other devices that we already have. Another similar handheld is the Odin 2. This one is a bit bigger because it's got a 6-inch screen as well as some bigger bezels to it, but you can see that it also kind of looks like a bigger brother to the RP6. And finally, one more 6-inch device. This is the Conquer Pocket Fit, and yes, this one is also both wider and taller overall. When it comes down to it, there are no surprises with the Retroid Pocket 6. As soon as I picked it up, I was like, oh yeah, this is very similar to the Retroid Pocket 5. It's a device that I would consider to be very portable, but not necessarily pocketable, and that's because of these ergonomic bumps, and it's also quite tall once you put it in your pocket. So unless you've got really big pockets and you don't mind walking around with a bit of extra bulge down there, then I think it's probably just better to throw it in a case and toss it in your backpack instead, much like how it was with the Retroid Pocket 5. One thing I did notice about the Retroid Pocket 6 is that the ergonomic bumps feel quite a bit more pronounced than the Retroid Pocket 5. I broke out my calipers and yeah, they're about 26mm at the thickest point against the shell, which is about 3.5mm thicker than the RP5. It's certainly not the thickest handheld that I've seen that's around this mid-range size. It's thinner than the Odin 3 as well as the original Odin 2. So I wouldn't call its ergonomic bumps excessive, but they are significant. And to me, they actually feel pretty comfortable. I've always been a big fan of ergonomic bumps on a device, and so I do appreciate that they're a little bit thicker. The bumps on the RP5 weren't bad, but they felt more like a suggestion than anything, and the RP6 feels like something that I can really grab. It's not to the point of being Steam Deck levels of ergonomics, but I think it does feel quite comfortable to hold for such a compact form factor. It's also a pleasure to hold along the front as well, and that's because it's more rounded than previously. The Retroid Pocket 5 had more of a steep gradient to it. It's not to the point of being a sharp edge, but you can definitely feel that transition. And I think that the Retroid Pocket 6 just softened that overall feel, so overall I think it is better on the front as well as the back for me. Putting it all together, I would say that this design is good. It's comfortable, it's rounded in all the right places. I like these ergonomic bumps, but it is a little bit unexciting compared to other devices we've seen over the past couple years. It definitely feels more like a subtle upgrade over the Retroid Pocket 5, mostly in specs more than anything. So let's talk about the controls. We're going to start with the analog sticks since they're up top. These are the same sticks that we've been seeing for years from companies like Retroid and AYN. They are Hall sensor sticks and they've got a nice range of motion to them. They are a little bit small, but the caps themselves can be pulled off and you can replace them with 3D printed options that I've shown on this channel before. You can even buy some larger sticks like for the Odin 3, they're going to work on this post as well. That's one of the nice things about these sticks is that they can be changed out and they're universal. Now the caps themselves I think are great. They're the same caps as far as I can tell as the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. They have a nice grippy texture to them. I think they feel excellent. So overall, yes, I like these sticks. If we go into the top-down menu, we can change out the LEDs around the analog sticks too. You can change out to whatever color you'd want and adjust the brightness and saturation, or you can just turn them off if you don't want to see them either. As far as the actual input, it feels excellent. I've got a wide range of motion here, no cardinal snapping. The dead zones are very small. It's got a circular input, and I think it feels very smooth. So overall, like we've seen with previous devices, these sticks are great, and you can calibrate them in the settings if you want to tweak them a little bit more. Now let's talk about this D-pad. It's almost identical to all the other D-pads that we've seen from Retroid over the past several years. It is a PS Vita style D-pad. It's got a very PS Vita style look to it as well because of these crystal transparent buttons. Like with the others, this is a dome switch D-pad. It feels very good, very accurate, and it doesn't have the same amount of cushiness you would get from a rubber membrane, but it is very nice and satisfying and quiet. In terms of practical use, it's going to pass most of the tests that I normally will do on this channel. For example, with Contra, I can press down and then rock it left and right lightly, and the character won't move. It's great. This means that I can mostly avoid accidental diagonals on some of the more sensitive games like Contra and Tetris. If I want to give it more pressure and actually push it to the point that it's going to click in one direction or the other, I can definitely make the character move, but I love the fact that we get that forced feedback. And this is exactly how it is with a bunch of other handhelds, especially those from Retroid and AYN. They have these nice dome switches. It's also going to work great in a wide variety of different use cases. For example, with Street Fighter style games, it's a very precise and clicky input. I personally learned how to play these games on a rubber membrane D-pad with the Super Nintendo controller, so it does take me a bit of time to acclimate to the experience of using a dome switch D-pad, but once you get the hang of it, I think that it's a good all-arounder as well. I do think it would have been more comfortable if the D-pad was more inboard, pushed to the right where my thumb naturally rests. When playing a retro game, I can definitely feel a little bit of strain here just by virtue of having to shift my thumb and my hand a little bit too. This is very common with devices that are this size, and so I think the only real fix is to get a larger handheld overall. Even though they call this a quote-unquote bezel-less display, my guess is that there is a bezel hidden under the panel on the left and right here. That's why we have so much empty space. This is another consequence of trying to make this device as small as possible. Let's talk about these face buttons because they are great. They are a true improvement over the Retroid Pocket 5. Number one, they look great. I love the fact that they're crystal buttons. It gives me a very big PlayStation vibe, but they also feel great. They are super quiet. They push down really nicely. They're rubber membrane, and they have a really nice and clicky feel to them. One of my main complaints about the Retroid Pocket 5 is that these buttons were a little bit loud and clacky, and the Retroid Pocket 6 buttons feel silent by comparison. They're not actually silent buttons, but between the two, they are a lot quieter. In fact, let's do a quick sound test comparing the Retroid Pocket 5 to the Retroid Pocket 6 and a couple other handhelds sprinkled in. So overall, yes, I'm very happy with the sound and feel of these buttons. To give you an idea, I would probably give the Retroid Pocket 5 about an 8 out of 10 in terms of buttons, but I would give a 9 out of 10 to the Retroid Pocket 6. Not quite perfect, but very, very close. Below the face buttons, we've got the right analog stick. It's the same as the left analog stick, but one thing I have noticed is it's a little bit tight in proximity to the face buttons themselves. So I found that as I'm playing retro games, I can definitely feel that my thumb touches against the right analog stick. Not a big deal, and not a deal breaker in any way, but it is something that I noticed, much like with other handhelds that are this size. Also on the front, we've got our select and start buttons, as well as our home and back buttons in Android, the exact same design as we saw on the Retroid Pocket 5, and then finally we've got our two stereo speakers. Let's do a quick audio sample with various games so you get an idea of what it sounds like. I don't want to temper your expectations too much, but I will say that they sound pretty much the same as the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Flip 2. And like with those handhelds, they're not the best speakers in the world, but they do get the job done. This thing was first announced, I was pretty excited. I didn't really own any of those devices back in the day, so it's pretty cool to have a 2025 version. However, the RG Slide very much so feels like a Generation 1 product. So in the end, I would say the audio quality is acceptable, but not exceptional. I can hear a difference between the high, mids, and lows, and everything feels pretty balanced, but there are parts where it feels a little bit muffled, especially with dialogue, and I do wish that they had an audio mixer with an Android settings so that we could tweak it ourselves. I don't want to harp on this too much, but I also miss the fact that the original design had these speakers placed below the screen, because as I'm holding the device, I cover up the speakers a little bit with the palms of my hands, and this wouldn't have been a thing if we had had that original design. Moving up top, we've got our volume up and down, as well as our sleep and power button, and then we've got these shoulders and triggers, and these are also excellent. The shoulder buttons are clicky, but not too loud, and the trigger buttons are an analog input. They feel great. They've got a nice balance to them in terms of overall size and throw. I think they are excellent small-sized triggers. I think the best compliment that I can give to the overall control experience is that it kind of gets the job done when playing a first-person shooter game, even without a grip. I always consider these types of games to be a nightmare on the Retroid Pocket 5 just because the analog sticks were both down below and everything felt very imbalanced and off-kilter, and this one feels a lot better to me. I think the ergonomics can probably be improved even more with a 3D printed grip or even the official one from Retroid, which I will test as soon as I can, but in a pinch, I can still play it on its own, which is a great sign. On the bottom, we've got our microSD card flap, so this pulls out right here. You can see I put a card in here already. Then we've got our headphone jack as well as a USB-C port for charging and video out. On the back, we've got two buttons that can be programmed however you would like, and my best compliment for them is the fact that I didn't really notice them until I actually started looking on the back, and I think that's a great thing. The placement overall is excellent. I can kind of feel it, but as I'm actually playing a game, I don't really notice it, and I don't press them accidentally, which is a win-win. You can program them in the software for basically anything you would like. Any other button on the device will work here. Other than that, on the back, we've got our Retroid Pocket logo and then the cooling system, so our fan intake in the center, and then the exhaust, which comes out mostly on the right side. Next, let's talk about the screen, and first things first, it's very bright. It gets up to 550 nits, and it makes it excellent to use outdoors. Now, as I'm recording this here in Hawaii, it is a bit cloudy, so it's not a full-on direct sunlight comparison, but you can see that it's very easy to use outdoors. We've also got a wide range of brightness. Here we are at 100%, but in general, I've been playing at around 50 or 60% brightness, but it also gets quite dim too. If we go all the way down, it gets very hard to see, which means it's going to be excellent to play in a dark environment too, so a great range overall. As far as saturation and color temperature, I think it also looks very good. It's nice and balanced, maybe just a shade cooler than the Retroid Pocket 5 screen, but very similar too. So if you're looking for something with colors that just pop and nice deep blacks, then this OLED panel is going to be a dream come true. Now, one thing I did notice about the screen on my first day of testing is that the coating on it seems to be different than the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Retroid Pocket G2. It's still a glass panel, but it seems to retain smudges a little bit more. Just to make sure I wasn't taking crazy pills, I did ask the company if this has a different coating than those other devices, and they confirmed that yes, this has a different sparkle effect coating, and I personally think I'm not a huge fan of it. It takes a lot of work to wipe it clean. All these devices tend to be smudge magnets because you're tapping on the screen all the time, especially with an all-glass front, and so I end up having to use a microfiber cloth on them all the time, but this one takes more work than usual to actually wipe it clean. I'm going to try out a variety of different cloths to see if any of them will buff it out a little bit better, but the ones that I have here in the studio just aren't really getting the job done. It's been a little bit annoying over the past day. It's actually to the point where I think I'm going to pick up one of these tempered glass screen protectors and put it over the front because the glass on this is going to be a little bit easier to wipe clean. And so even though I don't like putting a screen protector on an all-glass front like this just because it makes it a little bit thicker, the fact that I'm even looking into doing this says something about this screen in general. I do realize that I am a picky guy when it comes to this stuff. It's kind of the theme of this entire channel, and you may not care about it at all, but it is one thing that I noticed that this screen does retain more smudges than I would like. Now, one question that people have been asking me about this screen is whether or not it has heavy PWM flickering. That is when you will see a black flicker across the screen. It's a way of reducing brightness, and some people get headaches from it, much like they would with a CRT television. And so I tested it against the Anbernic RG557, which probably has the worst PWM flickering that I've seen on a handheld to date. So to start, here they are both at max brightness, and number one, you will see the RP6 is brighter than the RG557, but at max brightness, you usually will not see PWM flickering because it's not using those black lines, and so this is going to look just fine. As we start to reduce the brightness down to about 50%, you can see the flickering on the RG557. Now, the naked eye usually cannot see this at all. I'm filming at 30 frames per second, so that's why it's being picked up on camera. Either way, you can see that the Anbernic is getting PWM flickering, and the Retroid Pocket 5 doesn't have any visible flickering at all. Same thing if we drop it down to 25% brightness, you can see that the flickering is even heavier on the Anbernic RG557, but I'm still not seeing anything on the Retroid Pocket 6. This is the same result that I've seen on other high-quality panels like the RP5, the Odin 3, the Odin 2 Portal, and so overall, yeah, I think the PWM flickering is not going to be an issue with the Retroid Pocket 6. Okay, now let's talk about performance and benchmarks. We're going to start with Wildlife Extreme Stress Test by 3D Mark. So this is a 20-minute test that does 1-minute loops, and it pushes the device pretty hard, mostly on the GPU side, but it's a great way to compare it against other handhelds. And so here are the results of the test that I took earlier today. We got a top score of 3735. That is the best loop that we got, and the worst one we got was 3701. So we have a very stable experience here running at the highest performance mode and the highest fan. 99.1% stability. This means that you can expect a very consistent performance as you play over an extended period, especially on the high-end level. And this is great. This means that the cooling is doing its job. We also lost 10% battery over this 20-minute period, and if you extrapolate that to 1 hour, that means that 30% battery drain over 1 hour when pushing this device to the max. That means you'll get a little bit over 3 hours of battery life when pushing it really hard with something like a benchmark. I'll do more thorough testing of the battery later, but that's a really good sign. If we're going to be able to push it as hard as we can and still get 3 hours of battery life, that's excellent. So earlier today, I took out 10 different handhelds and I did the exact same test, the 20-minute loop test with 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme. For each of these devices, I made sure they were fully updated and updated the 3D Mark app as well, and then just did that 20-minute loop. And of note, all of these devices were running at their highest performance mode and the highest fan setting as well to get the best cooling and most stability possible. There's a lot of data here, but let's try to extrapolate as much as possible really quickly. So on the very bottom, we've got the Retroid Pocket 5 with the Snapdragon 865. This is a $200 handheld. This one has very stable performance. The cooling does great for this chipset, and you can see that we've got an average of 99.3 stability, but the score itself is less than half of the Retroid Pocket 6. Moving up one row is the Retroid Pocket G2. This one's kind of like a Retroid Pocket 5 Pro because it's exactly the same but with a better chipset. This one costs $20 more and it's only $10 cheaper than the Retroid Pocket 6, but the performance is not quite there compared to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, at least in this benchmark. It's about 20 to 25% worse, and the stability is not quite there either, 91.8%, which also makes sense because this cooling was made for the Snapdragon 865, not the G2 Gen 2, so it's not quite as efficient. Moving up one row is the Anbernic RG557 with the Dimensity 8300 chipset in it. It's a little bit more expensive than the Retroid Pocket 6, but the performance is not there either. Just today, I updated to the latest version of the Anbernic stock software, and that caused a lot of stability issues at the high performance mode. You can see here that I was not able to actually finish the test. I tried it about 5 or 6 times, and usually around minute 11, it would reset the device completely, and so it would just completely crash. So I wasn't able to get a full idea of how it works in terms of stability or anything. I was able to get a 1-minute test done, and that score was 3214. So it's a pretty respectable score, but the stability obviously is having issues with Anbernic stock software. I'm going to put a custom OS called Gamma OS on it here soon and see if that improves the stability, because I think it will. Moving up from there, we've got a bunch of Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 devices, everything from the Odin 2 line of devices and the AYN Thor. And you can see that the scores here are very similar, but the Retroid Pocket 6 actually outperforms a couple of the other ones in terms of stability as well as just the overall highest score. All these rows are in order based on the lowest score altogether. That means that the absolute worst score that it got is the highest one that we're ranking right here. And the only device with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 with the current software that ran better than it is the Odin 2 Mini. Now there's a lot of variation that's involved here in terms of like the thermal paste that they put on it and a lot of other factors. So I'm not saying that the Retroid Pocket 6 is better performing than any of the other devices, but it is nice to see that it is stable and it also holds its own compared to these other ones as well. Moving up from there, we've got the Conquer Pocket Fit with the Snapdragon G3 Gen 3, which is the equivalent of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. So it's a generation ahead, and this one gets a much better score because it is a better chipset. It is worth noting that this one had the worst stability of all the devices that I tested in this mid to high end range. range. And then finally at the very top, we've got the current King handheld, the AYN Odin 3 with the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset. Again, another generation ahead of the other devices, and those scores reflect it. This device also starts a full $100 more than the Retroid Pocket 6, so it really depends on whether or not you want to go with the very high end or something in the mid-range at $230 with the RP6. It's also worth noting that compared to the other Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 devices, this one is quite a bit cheaper. Now, GPU benchmarks like Wildlife Extreme only tell one part of the story. When it comes to emulation, a CPU benchmark actually gives us a better indication of how it's going to do when it comes to emulating higher-end systems, because single-core and multi-core CPU scores mean a lot more. So here we have the Retroid Pocket 5, the G2, and then, of course, today's Retroid Pocket 6. And you can see that it follows a pretty distinct line, where it's almost double the performance when it comes to the Retroid Pocket 6, and then the G2 is surprisingly close to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 when it comes to CPU performance. What this says to me is that there's a pretty big improvement from the Retroid Pocket 5 to the Retroid Pocket 6, especially if you're going to be emulating higher end stuff like PS2 and Nintendo Switch. You're going to get a much better experience on the RP6, but the G2 can also hold its own. I'm going to talk about these two more in my final review, but I think this really goes to show what I've been thinking this entire time, in that because there's a $10 difference between the two, I don't really see much of an incentive to stick with the G2 compared to the Retroid Pocket 6, just because we've got additional options in terms of the D-pad and analog stick placement, and a higher refresh rate on the display, and of course a slightly more powerful chipset. So long story short, when it comes to benchmark performance, the Retroid Pocket 6 performs exactly as I expected. Now, another aspect that goes hand in hand with benchmarking is overall cooling and performance, especially when it comes to fan noise and just whether or not it's stable. And we already saw that this is a very stable cooling experience, but what about the fan noise? Right off the bat, I did notice this is a relatively quiet fan. Even if you put it in the highest setting, it's kind of hard to hear overall. But I also did notice a bit of coil whine with my particular device when putting it in the highest fan mode. So I'm going to give you a listen so you can hear the overall pitch of this fan. I don't think it's the end of the world, and like I said, it's very quiet, but this might bother you. Thankfully, it is a quiet fan, especially compared to other similar models. For example, the Odin 3 feels like a jet engine by comparison. Here's another sample. Okay, next I did some light emulation and other game testing, but again, I've only had this device for about 24 hours, so I just kind of breezed through my favorites to see what the experience is going to be like. When it comes to handheld systems, it was exactly what I expected. All this stuff is going to play absolutely fine. Moving into 8 and 16-bit systems, this is where things got interesting because we have that 120 Hz display. So in this setup, I basically threw everything that I could at it. I used the CRT beam simulator shader, which gives us improved motion clarity thanks to having 120 Hz to work with. And also because it's a powerful chipset, I threw on the CRT Geom Deluxe shader too, which gives it a nice CRT effect and softens everything and makes it look a lot more rich and deep. In addition, I turned on 1 frame of run ahead to reduce the overall input latency, and it's an excellent retro gaming experience, all things considered. You're going to get 4.5 inches of screen real estate when playing 4x3 content like this, and I think it looks great. To give you an idea of performance, I was able to do these settings with just about every retro system. For example, here with Dreamcast, I'm playing it here in an upscale 1080p with widescreen hacks turned on, but then all the other stuff in RetroArch that I threw at it. The CRT beam simulator shader plus the CRT Geom Deluxe, and then 1 frame of run ahead, and everything's running really well. The only system in RetroArch where I had to make an adjustment to this overall setup was Sega Saturn using the Beetle Saturn core, which is very demanding. The only change I had to do with this setup is that I had to turn run ahead off because it was just too demanding for the CPU, but I was still able to use CRT beam simulator as well as a CRT Geom Deluxe shader. Everything looked great and was playing at full speed, just without that run ahead. The RP6 is also going to be excellent for PSP, much like like other Retroid Pocket devices, all the way back to the 3 Plus, these have been able to play upscaled at full speed, and so this is no different. 1080p upscale, it looks beautiful on this OLED panel. The real difference is going to come when playing the higher end systems, GameCube, PS2, and beyond, because most of these are going to be set and forget. Within Dolphin, I played everything at a 3x resolution upscale, and in general, the only settings tweak that I have to do is to decide between OpenGL for accuracy or Vulkan for speed. The vast majority are going to play great with OpenGL, but a couple give you a more consistent performance with Vulkan backend, for example F-Zero GX. Again, at a 3x resolution upscale with the widescreen turned on, this looks awesome. You're going to get the same performance with PS2 as well, where you can push it up to 2.5x resolution, which will blow it up to 1080p, and all these games are going to play just great. In fact, with this one, I rarely would turn it from OpenGL over to Vulkan. Everything plays at full speed. So here with God of War 2, I'm playing it with OpenGL turned on and 2.5x resolution, no problem whatsoever. In fact, with OpenGL, I was able to play it at a 4x resolution or 1440p with no problem. It only really was once I got to a 5x resolution upscale that I saw a bit of slowdown. And at that point, you probably could just switch it over to Vulkan and it's going to play at full speed anyway. So overall, yes, this is going to eat through most PS2 games. I also tested some other high-end systems like Wii U and Switch, but I'm going to save those for the review, but suffice to say that they performed exactly as expected with a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. I also did some PC game testing with GameHub and Game Native, but I was kind of limited in both time, but then also I've only got 128 gigs of internal storage with this particular model. Either way, I tested out Octopath Traveler 2 in GameHub, as you can see here, and this is kind of a middleweight RPG, and it's running just great. I upscaled it to a 1080p, so everything's looking excellent, and then I also capped it to a 30 frames per second experience. This game will probably play around 40 frames per second if you want to push it all the way, but I found that 30 was a lot more stable and it's not quite as demanding. And so this is how I would play this game, especially with an RPG where the frame rate doesn't make that big of a difference. So this device is going to work great for PC gaming like other Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 handhelds, but beware that, it only maxes out at 256 gigs of internal storage, so you're not going to be able to put a ton of PC games on it since those have to be stored internally. I also tested out some native Android games, mostly to get a feel for the controls and then whether or not these games are going to work properly. So here is Destiny Rising with the highest settings possible on this device, and it's running absolutely fine, 60 frames per second. Like I said before, having the analog stick up top really helps in terms of controls when playing FPS games, and so I could see myself playing more Destiny Rising in the future on this particular handheld. I also tried out Grid Legends here, highest settings possible, and also downloaded the high texture packs. Everything is running great here as well. All the controls work perfectly. And then finally, to round out my first day of testing, I did some game streaming as well, both locally and in the cloud. First, let's talk about streaming locally. So this is Hades running on a computer here in the studio, and I'm just playing it as it is. I'm playing at 120 frames per second, and I'm getting an average of about 2 to 2.5 milliseconds of decoding time here in Apollo and Artemis. To me, this means that it's going to be an excellent device for local game streaming. If you've got a PC in your house, but you want to play on your couch, this can be an excellent time overall. I also tried out Xbox Game Pass via NVIDIA GeForce Now. I'm using the paid tier, which allows me to play at 120 frames per second. I can also upscale this to 1080p and then use the ultra settings too, and it's still going to run at 120 FPS. This is an excellent experience if you're playing from the cloud. Now, I live in Hawaii, and so my ping is pretty bad. It's around 60 milliseconds, but if you're on the mainland US, you should probably get some better speeds than this. Regardless, I think that this device is going to do a great job when it comes to streaming. The only downside I can see is that it's only a 5.5-inch display, which does get a little bit small when playing modern games. Okay, we've done a ton of testing for an impressions video, so let's start wrapping up and talk about my good and bad impressions so far with the Retroid Pocket 6. And there is a lot to like here on the left side. It's got an excellent size and shape overall. It's kind of a tried and true design. It feels a lot like the Retroid Pocket 5, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's also an excellent screen. It's OLED 1080p, 5.5 inches, and 120 Hz is excellent when it comes to retro gaming and using things like black frame insertion as well as CRT beam simulator shaders. So I'm really happy with this screen overall. I also can't say enough good things about the improved face buttons. They're much quieter, they are less clacky, they feel like a significant improvement over their previous model. Another big improvement is the fact that we have a choice between where we want our analog stick and D-pad, and I love the fact that it feels a bit more personalized when you purchase this device, and it's the first time we've seen it from a major handheld brand. I also continue to love the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and its performance. It's got wide compatibility. We can play just about anything on Android with this chipset. There are devices that can run a little bit better, but they are going to cost more and they may not have the same compatibility as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. So very happy with the chip choice here. And then finally, I think it's worth noting that Retroid has some rock-solid Android software. We'll talk about this more in the review, but there isn't really a lot that's changed here, but they've done a very good job just making it very stable and seamless, and I think that's worth paying attention to. Now, of course, no device is perfect, but it was kind of hard for me to find some bad impressions with this device, and many of these are very subjective. The first is that I'm not a fan of this new texture and coating that they've put on the glass on the front here. It just seems to be quite smudgy and it retains the smudges more than I would like. To put it another way, I had to use glass cleaning wipes on this display about 3 or 4 times throughout my day of testing, and that's not something I would normally have to do. I think time will tell whether or not this is going to bother other people as well, but if you are happening to pick up this device, I think it might be worth spending the $6 to get the screen protector just in case you don't like this texture and coating like I do. Speaking of texture, another thing that I wasn't a huge fan of is the slick plastic texture on the back of it, and most of this has to do with the fact that I got very used to the grippy texture on the Retroid Pocket 5, so this did feel a bit like a downgrade. On the bright side, it does make the device look more nostalgic and retro, but if I had to choose between the two, I would rather have the grippier texture. And then finally, the last of my 3 nitpicks, this does feel a bit like a generic design. After all, it just kind of looks like a Retroid Pocket 5, or kind of like an Odin 3, but a bit smaller, and I was hoping for something a bit more unique from Retroid, because they usually will try a completely different design with each of their iterations. Part of this probably has to do with the fact that I saw that original design, and I loved it, and then we got this other one instead. And so, personally, if I could go back in time, I would convince 10,000 of my closest friends to vote for the one up top instead of the one down below, because I think there are a lot of good benefits to it. Not only do those 4 function buttons just look a lot more retro and nostalgic and more PSP-like, but it makes the device taller, which I think is going to make it more comfortable. It also adds additional space between the face buttons and the analog stick, which I again think would be more comfortable. And then of course we have those speakers down below the screen, which I think would have improved the audio as well. So part of this is just me lamenting about what could have been with the previous design, but I do think the new one is a bit more sterile and generic. So wrapping up this very long impressions video, you might be wondering whether or not I'm happy with the Retroid Pocket 6, and this is a very easy yes. There are a couple things that I don't really like, but overall there are way more positives than negatives with this handheld. I love the fact that they kind of stuck to their guns and made something that's an improved Retroid Pocket 5. Better performance, better screen, and overall better comfort and controls. I think the bigger question is whether or not this is going to be worth upgrading if you already have a similar device like the Retroid Pocket 5 or maybe an Odin 2. It's really going to depend on your own use case and what you're looking for in terms of shape and size. And I think that's something that I'll explore more in the final review in about a week. For now, I'm just really looking forward to testing the Retroid Pocket more until I make that final review, because it kind of feels like an endgame smaller mid-range handheld. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you interested in picking up a Retroid Pocket 6, or do you already have something similar? And also let me know what you would like to see in my final review. What games would you like me to test, what platforms, and other factors as well. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.